Game On, a winning playbook for risk and compliance. We have a lot of really interesting topics for today, exploring the role of risk and compliance and fast-paced change. We're going to be talking a bit about the opportunity to synthesize context in a new way. I think organizations really have the opportunity to tap into a new real-time view of risk, but also story live those novel risks in a way that builds capability for your team. And then, of course, setting guardrails for response. Obviously, one of the big elements of the role of compliance and risk is ensuring that our organizations know the boundaries by which we need to manage the organization, and what do you do when those things are constantly changing. I'm Paula Fontana. I lead global marketing for Luminar. I've played all sorts of roles all over the course of my career, kind of in and out of the industry, risk management. Over the course of that career, I also spent about 10 years in ed tech, leading product and operations. And it's sort of an interesting moment in the industry in that we're really, from my perspective, it's really about how do we embed continuous learning across our global operating environment. So I'm excited to dive into that a bit more. But Andrea, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Andrea Eklund, I'm the Senior Vice President, Chief Compliance Officer for Unity Point Health. Unity Point Health is a 3-state health system in the U.S. We have about 34,000 employees, 1,200 providers, and I am a licensed attorney by background, but I've spent better of the last 18 years in compliance, enterprise risk management, amongst other areas I have oversight, and really just looking forward to bring healthcare to the space today. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Andrea. Excited to have you. James.
Yeah, hi, everyone. James Green. I'm the co-founder of Illuminate Advisory. We have about 33,997 employees less than Andrea and her team at Unity Health. I've spent the last 15 years in the risk and resilience profession. I'm really excited to talk about the intersection of risk and compliance today.
Fantastic. Well, we are thrilled to have you, James, as always. So just, a little scene setting, I think, for the conversation today. I think we've all been experiencing disruption as the new normal. And I think the message that we're all living is you just embrace it, right? We're going with it. And I think the reality is that organizations and our teams are going to need different skills to really thrive in the workplace of the future. And front and center of that, obviously, has been this narrative around AI and generative generative AI, but it doesn't stop there, right? We're all faced with a number of novel risks over the last several years, and how do we effectively navigate that environment where there is no script, right? There is no historical data to draw from in many of these cases, climate risk being another one. What we're seeing in terms of the challenges to building sustainable business models, for whether you live in insurance, whether you live in financial services, whether you're in manufacturing and navigating supply chain impact in a new way. The world fundamentally has changed, and away from an era where of predictability and certainty to one that is very nebulous, and it's really about sussing out patterns within great ambiguity. And so the topic for today that we're focused on is ensuring that we're able to prepare our organizations for today's world and tomorrow's world, in all of this uncertainty, in all of the disruption that we're experiencing. How do we make sure that our teams have the tools that they need to effectively respond and make decisions? So with that, we're going to jump into our first panel, our first poll here, and then we're going to follow with a panel question. How integrated are risk, resilience, and compliance at your organization? And while you answer that poll. We get your perspectives on that. Andrea, curious about your thoughts, related to this. There's been a shift in the role of compliance to one more recently, I'd say within the last several years, at least in a new way, right? I know this idea has been around for quite some time, but I think we're seeing it come to life in a new way. Really, compliance as the change enabler. What has been behind this change from your perspective?
Sure. I think coming from a healthcare perspective, COVID gave us a whole nother perspective into how compliance should be involved within enterprise risk management and this risk resiliency and response, because we had this common and all-consuming theme of competing regulatory requirements and constant change, competing healthcare delivery requirements and or recommendations with the CDC is coming out, or what state health care instruction is coming out with how to treat patients. And so there was only so much that you could do to comply and get a standard in place and educate folks, and then something was changing again. And so the organizations really had to take a very intentional step back and really go back to our driving values and core of we're in the business of treating patients. And at the end of the day, we need to do what is the best interest of the patient. And it's making the best informed decision that we can at that point in time with the information that we have and the resources we have to get a job done. And that's in the face of potentially facing a non-technically non-compliant regulatory requirement. But you do as good as you can in the moment because we're dealing with lives in that space. And so for us, COVID was, I think, a huge wake up in the healthcare industry on how to bring the unknowns risks into becoming known risks and intersecting risk management and compliance and resiliency all together. Because the reality of it is as an organization that is in one of the most highly regulated industries out there, a behavior the organization may choose to take may be to potentially take a fine or penalty, because to put an execution in place, or the amount of energy and resource it'll take to put something in place is a much greater cost to the organization than potentially the recourse of not complying. And so we had to become very nimble. And I don't know if you know that healthcare historically had not been entirely nimble. And so it's given us a whole new lens and how we look at bringing all of those components together so that we can make the most informed decision based on our organization's risk tolerance. And so everyone's working from the same frame of thinking and ultimately the best interest of the patient.
James, how have you experienced this, in your work as an advisor? How have you seen this evolve, like Andrea said, over the course of the last several years since the pandemic?
Well, yeah, I think it's really interesting through the lens of healthcare, where Andrew's expertise is. I think you've seen a lot of organizations where maybe historically risk and compliance were certainly isolated from each other, but also static organizations, because outside of healthcare, where the stakes are obviously much lower, we're not talking about true life or death decisions. The time to make decisions, you had longer time to make decisions. You had decisions that maybe you knew were coming up. And what we've seen the last 3 years with COVID, with civil unrest, with the world on fire, with climate change, the time to make decisions has greatly shortened for organizations, and the repercussions of those decisions have massively increased. So your successful organizations are taking risk and compliance from historically static domains and making them dynamic, because the amount of crises that are happening, like in cascading incidents, you've got less time. You have to make faster decisions, bigger decisions, and there's consequences. And like Andrea said, companies are now also looking at, okay, what is the fine? What is the cost to comply versus the business case? So you have companies that are making decisions. Okay, you're going to fine me $100. The cost to comply is $10,000. I'm going to take the fine. Like, that's within our risk appetite, and that'll be part of our compliance program now.
So as you think about, I think one of the things, just observing, the element of human behavior in, when faced with the unexpected. I think we talk a lot about preparedness in the context of known risks, right? Or known events that we've experienced. I think we do a lot of training for the last event that we experienced when we should be training for the next one in a lot of ways. But that's a much different problem to solve than training for known things. So how has that evolved? So when in this kind of sea of the unexpected and the unpredictable, how do you ensure that you have the right capability embedded in your team?
Sure. So I'm happy to start there. It really comes down to first having a good framework of an emergency or instant response plan in place, because having deciphering roles and role clarification in those situations is key. And although today I'm Andrea Eklund, Chief Compliance Officer, my role in an instant response may not be to serve that function. My role may be an administrative coordinator. And really, it's having a playbook that sets out what roles do we need to have in place. Do we need somebody who needs to be the face to communications and the external face of the organization? Do we need someone who needs to be on point with vendors? And it's clearly identifying those roles and knowing that folks are trained and educated on serving that role in that capacity, or what skill sets need to be in play for that skill set, for that role or capacity. And then from there, in healthcare, our operations are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When we're doing desktop exercises or game playing the cyber event, we are doing it while we are still treating patients. We're doing it as responsibly as we can in an isolated manner, but there is a balance of giving the most realistic potential exposure to a situation where, let's say, for example, all of our lab systems go down, and then our facilities hit with a tornado, and our data storage goes down. At the end of the day, our operations are 24/7. We don't have the ability to be intentional about playing through what is a potential gameplay situation, to think those things through. We're often faced with doing them real time and learning from them, which is good. But even that in itself brings risks that you have to prepare for. So by way of example, if we are doing a tabletop exercise where we feel we're potentially responding to maybe lab operations down in our lab folks, and we're working through that, we have patients who are observing potentially or interacting with individuals who are working through this activity. That's something that could get out from a media perspective, where people think that something's happening within our institution. So you even have to be able to respond to the potential implications of those situations. So it's really having those playbooks ahead of time and being able to work through them and becoming more comfortable with making hard decisions in the moment, and going through the what if scenarios, because it's going through and the constant asking of, well, what if? And then what, that helps us get to that full thought process to turn those unknowns into known risks. Key identifiers, do we have the same administrator who's responsible for multiple systems? Both those systems go down, which one goes up first? Those are little things that people just don't think about until you go through kind of a tabletop or word game kind of exercise as you're thinking through these situations.
Yeah, I think, Paula, to your point earlier, we as people and organizations, we love to mitigate the last known risk. So right now, every company has the most robust pandemic response plans I've ever seen in my life, and they probably don't need them. And from a compliance standpoint, look at, after WorldCom and Enron came Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States. And after the 2008 Great Recession came all these financial regulations. They're all looking backwards, but they didn't protect like what happened recently with FTX, and they have no, scope around is cryptocurrency a security as stated in the US or not. So for me, the key is, like Andrew said, those teams, those people. I want a resilient crisis management team. I want resilient decision makers. So regardless of what the next bump in the night is, I know I've got the right people in the room. I know they're going to communicate with each other effectively, with stakeholders effectively. And time is of the essence now. I think we've kind of briefly mentioned brand. And nowadays, your customers probably know when you've had a compliance or risk issue before your board does. So how are you managing that response? Are you proactive? Are you reactive? A lot of these organizations are defensive, which immediately, people think, oh, they must have something to hide because they're defensive. So you've got to have those teams. And right now, I feel like speed wins, regardless of what the issue is.
And to that point, James, how do you have your brand and your marketing team as part of that crisis response team or incident response team? We have our communication cascade built into our enterprise risk management table that helps identify what information is escalated and what information is cascaded, depending on the risk that we're faced with. And our crisis management firm is already on retainer. We have and utilize so that we know that we have that extension available to us if needed. Because in the era of social media, in the era of just news traveling fast, perception is now reality, unfortunately, regardless if it is or not. One's perception can greatly turn into reality. We know any Snapchat or TikTok video or anything taken of an altercation and ED between a security guard and a mental health patient could look very poorly, even though that security guard may be doing everything they possibly can to be protecting that patient from themselves and harming themselves. But it takes just, a snippet of time of information to be released. And, what do you say to that? And can you say anything? Are you regulatorily in healthcare? Can you even say anything and even acknowledge based on patient privacy confidentiality laws? So you have all of these competing factors, but again, marketing, the brand component is one of the seats at the table when we're talking about incident and crisis response.
Absolutely. Somebody asked in the chat, to what degree are you seeing success in getting companies to look forward instead of backwards? I think we've seen more companies' willingness to look forward the last 18 months, just because if you say to them, if I would have told you in 2019, these 12 different things are going to happen, you wouldn't believe me. You'd laugh me out of the room. So just we are seeing more companies willing to look forward when considering risk and compliance events than I've seen in my career.
And frankly, our insurers are acting for it. Our insurers are now coming to the table and wanting to know, what is your ERM program look like, and how are you prepared when considering whether they're going to insure you in certain spaces. They're now expecting that we be more proactive, and the experts out there would say, hey, COVID was not a black swan event. We should have been prepared for COVID. It should not have been a black swan event. But everyone's treating it like it was. And the reality of it is it became one because the scaling and the breadth of it being a global issue wasn't isolated to a specific region or state, what have you.
Yeah, I think to that point, I mean, that's what we've seen, more in the realm of resiliency is, regulators and, public policy institutions, wading into the waters of, how do we ensure that we're able to navigate disruption. And, as a result, I think in some ways it's generated a lot of alignment within the ecosystem, but at the same time, it's also generated a lot of confusion, to your point about additional factors that you're needing to weigh as a result of different policies and various legal implications. What's interesting is that one of the questions submitted from Yosef, he's talking about how working within his organization, this concept of compliance as change enabler, as opposed to the person running around with a hammer, and really being that that organization that helps socialize and educate the factors surrounding effective decision making. Like as that has come into play, I know, Andrew, you have a really interesting perspective on how to do this effectively at the board and executive level. How have you effectively, and it looks like we've got an audience that has had some success in integrating these functions of risk compliance and resilience. But how have you done that at more of a senior level?
Sure. So, I think it starts with some nudging by our government, right? Department of Justice, United States came out with a memo outlining an effective compliance program. And a big piece of having an effective compliance program is to be a risk-based program, to focus on those risks that are highest risk to the organization and to the government programs. Because when you're in the business of healthcare, especially as Unique Point is, where it literally is from all sectors of healthcare, our care delivery system, it's being intentional about what risk we choose to spend our time on. And so at the end of the day, helping understand for our organization, bringing enterprise risk management together with compliance was really a strategic decision for our board. The way in which healthcare delivery is now made has changed, it's shifted, which has impacted our financial stability within healthcare. And the organization is now leaning in with where do we want to go strategically so that we're viable in the future to provide patient care. And in doing so, how do we mitigate those risks, compliance and the like, that prevent us from getting there? And so from a board perspective, it's giving awareness of what is going to get in the way of our strategy. For us, and our number one risk across an entire portfolio of risk is labor and cost reduction. There was a great exodus in healthcare, and now to have that nurse at the bedside, we might have to spend a great deal of money just to staff a bed, but we have to have the bed open to care for our communities. And it's a vicious cycle. And so it's working within a higher conversation, a more strategic conversation, and getting buy-in and really direction from the board as to what is their risk appetite. And our executive leadership team is really helping navigate our onward strategy as to how we get there. And in doing so, mitigating those risks for the entire organization, but being intentional as to where we're spending our time and energy and resources, because we do not have, the financial stability that we necessarily had pre-COVID to do all of those things. So it's really become a pillar along with strategy. It's another thing that's not isolated, but rather it's a fully informed decision-making process for the board.
Labor shortage is a really interesting example, Andrea, because if you looked at companies' risk registers 5 years ago, labor shortage was number 875 for a lot of organizations. And now it's top 3 because if from a customer service or compliance standpoint, the less staff you have, the less effectively you take care of your customers, your patients. And then that's just kind of a downward spiral, whether it's a healthcare facility, whether it's a restaurant. I'm sure you've all seen local restaurants where they're suffering. So they have less service staff, they have less staff in the kitchen. So then the quality goes down. So customers leave. So they cut prices and then they just spiral all the way out until they're out of business. And I think you're seeing that, more so. There was a huge trucking firm in the United States that shut down yesterday, which is shocking to me that a trucking company would just shut their doors. They got into such an issue with labor shortage and with their union that their board felt the best alternative was just to dissolve. And I couldn't even imagine that 5 years ago. You have an organization with a $700 million loan from the US government and still says, we don't know how to deal with this risk of labor. And so, I think it's going to be a huge issue for a lot of organizations and a lot of professions such as healthcare, and it's gonna keep escalating.
And it's interesting, James, because you bring up that trucking example, and I immediately, I pinged our supply chain team because it is something you prepare for in that regard. But think about that from their shareholders, right? They're making a decision for their shareholders on for the viability of its organization. For us, for healthcare, our shareholders are our community.
Yeah.
We are not speaking to anyone other than the communities that we're sitting in, and ultimately are there to serve. And so as a not-for-profit organization, it's really the community sport you have to get behind us to make sure that we're keeping the doors open in some of those areas.
So Tim asked a question about following up on the discussion about playbooks and asking, about the difference between a playbook that's traditionally focused on scenarios versus incident frameworks, which are basically an adaptable set of guides that are tied back to a role or set of roles. And so how do you go about organizing playbooks that are able to flex to the situation?
Well, first of all, I think where Tim is right now, it's 1:30 in the morning. So I don't even know whether to applaud his dedication or that's
I am impressed.
And Tim knows I am not a fan of most scenario based playbooks, because Tim and I and a few other people on this call, we worked at a company during Arab Spring where the Egyptian government fell. And I did not have a business continuity playbook for what to do when the government falls. And really, since that time, I'm not a fan of scenario-based books, because then where do you stop? And you have 37 scenario-based books, and then we didn't have one for labor shortage, or we didn't have one for pandemic. I feel a lot of organizations spend more time creating scenario-based books and maintaining them than just updating. So generally for me, I like general crisis management response, general incident response, except for high likelihood, high impact events. So I live in Florida. We have hurricanes all the time. So my customers in Florida have crisis management. They also have a hurricane scenario because it happens all the time. So I don't like to see customers have 30, 40 scenario playbooks. I think other consultants do, full disclosure, because it's good revenue for them, honestly, because then someone has to create and maintain those. But I prefer more, team-based, and then the one-offs. Certainly right now, every company I work with has a cybersecurity, has ransomware, because it's happening. It's going to keep happening.
I think it does help you put you in the moment, though. I mean, something Andrea said in one of our prep sessions, was really hung with me. This concept of putting people in the story before the story happens. And it's not that that exact story is going to play out as you would anticipate it. I think what you want to do is put the person, put your team in that moment as they would experience it, or as close to how they would experience it in real life. So you have the same constraints in terms of, the decision timing, the pressure that you're feeling, right? The team dynamics, et cetera. I think when you design it purely around, well, here's your playbook, right? And orchestrate the steps in the playbook independent of the situation, I think it's difficult to emulate those conditions.
Yeah. So often too, and I agree with you, James. We really, I'm thinking of 3. We really focus on updating and upkeeping 3 playbooks that are one of which can track a couple different scenarios, but it's really 3. But when you talk about situational response, I think about walking through situations within individuals, and workplace violence events are huge in healthcare. And our communities, our team members are truly fearful. There's not a day goes by that we don't have a workplace violent event. And I'm not talking active shooter, but there's not a day that goes by that someone isn't punched or stabbed with a pen or something, whether it be from a patient or a visitor who's with a patient. It's unfortunate that that's, where we're at as in society, but folks are just not entirely, stable or have the same frame of mind that we did, a few years ago. And there's a lot of built up frustration. But what we can do is you can help navigate and walk through thought process and go through a think tank exercise with a group of people to ask and then what? Just get the thoughts, flowing and put on, that black hat and kind of criticize and push back on the frame of thinking, or put on, that white hat and think about, if everything went well, how would we be looking at it? But it's good to come to the table and talk through those things and kind of use that Socratic method of pulling information out for people so that they can think through the things in a controlled environment of how they may respond. So in the situation when there is a potential issue, that they're better informed, or they have more to bring to the thought process than maybe if it was isolated without any preparation.
That's such a great example, Andrea, of workplace violence in healthcare happening literally every single day, because those are the types of scenarios then where you do want playbooks, where you do want people trained in micro simulations in different scenarios, because it's a known event. It happens.
Yeah.
So it's definitely worth the time to build out, whether it's hurricanes in Florida or whether unfortunately it's workplace violence in healthcare. Here's a known event. So we should put additional time and thought, because it happens all the time.
Sure.
So horizon scanning, this is something that's gotten more and more complex as time has gone on. And part of it is like pure capability. The insight we can tap into today is really very different than what it was even a few years ago. And I intentionally created this poll to be very complex. So if you take a moment and just pop in your answers here, about what sorts of threats and dynamics you're tracking as a part of horizon scanning. But question for the two of you, how do you effectively understand, like in the context of complex and layered change, how do you effectively stay on top of that information? And it's really around like looking for that signal in noise, right? And what are the sorts of things that you're following, or what sorts of things are you measuring on the day-to-day, and how do you effectively make decisions on how that needs to translate to building team capability or adjusting how you respond to critical events?
Yeah, from my lens, it's not an individual activity. It is truly a senior executive team, key leader, contribution and effort. Again, aligning our ERM program with our strategy. We identified business owners for those specific risks, and those business owners know what our course of action is to mitigate against those risks. And in doing so, they are staying up to date on industry practices in those areas. So naturally, the Chief Human Resource Officer is looking at union activity, is looking at, if a local college has shut down due to whatever the circumstances, if our pipeline has changed, they're navigating, they're staying on top of what are those known risks. My focus and my team's focus outside of that is really all of the trade association and publicly available information that we can get our hands on in news and current events, and really categorizing those items into key areas that could hit our impact strategy. We were following very closely. I don't recall if it was FedEx or UPS, but potential strike. So I think it was UPS, maybe the potential strike activity there. And so working closely with our supply chain team to be on top and create a plan to have alternative ways for delivery, no different than this trucking company and shutting down. So following current events, trade association publications, and the resources, Paula, that your team puts on, I think are extremely helpful.
Yeah, you have to do all of these options that are on screen. And so to Andrew's point, that you have to have a wide net of people. If you just say, oh, well, Walter's in charge of horizon scanning for our organization, there's no way one person, even with every software available, can assimilate every piece of information out there. So yeah, you need everyone. It has to be the whole organization, the executive team, your risk team, compliance team, your field team, management. Everybody has to be looking at a certain part of it. And you have to, I think more importantly, you have to have a mechanism to bubble up what's really important and what's trending quickly as an emerging risk or what have you. Like that's the biggest breakdown I see is, and how many times have we seen after the fact something happens and it comes out in the news that somebody 30 levels down says, well, I've been trying to tell people that thing's going to happen and I didn't know how to escalate it, or nobody would listen. That's the biggest key for me for horizon scanning. Do you have communication methods to get new and emerging risk and events to decision makers in a short amount of time?
Something healthcare does really well that I don't see in other industries, Paula, is, we start our day at the bedside with the patients, and we have huddle teams, and those huddle teams meet throughout the day, and there's information that's cascaded through 5 levels of our organization. And by 11:40 every single day, I am hearing a report out. Our senior executive team and key senior leads in key areas like supply chain or revenue cycle are hearing report out of key issues that are within the spaces that have been presented from our, across our 3 states and our 34,000 employees, so that we have criteria for what information is escalated through that. And then similarly, we are cascading that information down, and that is how we communicated things like the potential strike. And how we are responding to it. So we have a communication cascade that comes out of that as well. And so every single day we have a level of awareness that and a forum for awareness and escalation of key needs or information. Sometimes it's the first time we've heard of things by the time we're getting at that tier 5. And it's extremely helpful because then you have other regions or other markets that are hearing that same information that may impact them as well. So when you're talking about having 3 states and as large of our footprint is, that is immediate information that's getting back across regions for further communication to their teams as well. So that is something that healthcare does, I think, extremely well.
Yeah, and to your point, Andrew, your organization is having those multiple layers of conversations by 11:40 each day. and not in a quarterly risk committee meeting that gets postponed.
Correct.
So.
Yeah, I don't think it's context alone to both your points. I think it's about how you take that context, marry that with the capability of your team, including the expertise embedded across your organization, and then establish that cross-functional connectivity to respond appropriately and in an intelligent way. I think technology, to Bob, your question that you had submitted, yeah, I think there's more promise in terms of how we leverage technology to more effectively suss out the signal that we should be paying attention to. But what I'm hearing and seeing from teams is that there's always going to be that human element of making a final call or discerning, yeah, this is something that we need to respond to, or this is something that we continue to monitor. But yeah, curious, James and Andrea, what are your thoughts in terms of the potential of technology to really fill the gap, that we're seeing in terms of whether it's building context, capability, or connectivity for our teams?
I think for me, the interesting thing, so I'm an old guy, right? And every 5 years, there's a new technology that's going to replace us all and save the world and mitigate all risk. So it was the cloud. We're going to put everything in the cloud, and that's magically going to solve risk. Well, the cloud is just servers. And then in the last 12 months, it was, crypto is going to change the world, and Web3. And now it's AI. I think it's great marketing hype, but I think people need to have the context that technology should be supporting what we do, and new technologies are amazing, but they have a lot of room for error. You've seen all these great posts all over social media with people using chat GPT to reply to jobs and, type essays for schools. Like, there's a lot of misdirection. There's potential there, and people definitely want to, always be analyzing technology. But like I said, I think the concern is always for me that there's no single piece of technology ever that now we're instantly in compliance with everything. We now have zero risk. There's not really a bright line with like that. Yes, no, it can certainly accelerate what we're doing with our programs. Software is definitely a huge enabler and catalyst for programs, but it's never going to take risk to zero. It's never going to take compliance to 100.
Yeah. I really see technology, and we use AI quite a bit with different auditing softwares and different things that we need to do so that we can focus our time on outlier cases, right? So things that seem to be outside of normal behavior activity that helps us hone in on where we're spending the time to research and the like. But I think technology can be a huge win to be an extension of the program, to do the follow-on training and education and the development and the role-based training and the giving the situational, gameplay kind of response across a large, stakeholder group of folks who come to the table from a different background and make it very much user-centric for them, because, there's not an unlimited number of team members on my team, and an organization, again, that comes down to an organization's risk tolerance and how well they even staff their compliance and risk and resiliency programs. And so that the other piece there is technology can be the extension to create some efficiencies. And often you can rely on, that resource, that tool to staying up to speed on some of those, new and emerging threats to help be an extension for the team. Technology is never going to be able to replace what we all do here. There is so much of a human component that goes to bringing those things together, and it's constantly changing. That won't happen. But what it can do is help us be intentional about where we spend our time and energy.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that I've long admired about the programs in healthcare settings is that you have such a crystallized North Star in terms of, why do you exist, right? And it's in broader service of the patient above all else. And so I think sometimes it's easy for us in other industries, technology especially, to lose sight of the fact that, this is all about serving the human, right? And at the end of the day, although technology can be a great enabler, to focus human beings on the things that, we are best focused on. At the same time, we need to be judicious about automating away the very human aspects of the experiences that make up our daily lives, right? And so I think there's a lot of benefit in leveraging technology. And that's one thing that stands out, with Illuminar is our ability to engage people in these bite-sized exercises in a way that almost feels frictionless. And Josh, our founder, talks about it being invisible, or we're working, in this direction of invisible technology in the interest of really embedding all of this context into the day-to-day. So it doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't feel like it's an interruption to how you would naturally respond, but you're that much more in tune with what's happening in the broader situation.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love this slide for two reasons. One, now I want some pecan pancakes from Cracker Barrel. Gamification is so important because everybody on this webinar, think about, you've been in an organization at some point that had annual training. And if it was a global organization, you had a lot of them. If it's FIs, there's a lot of them. Healthcare, you had a lot of them. And so I want you to think to yourself, did you actually learn anything during those trainings? How often, the last global company I worked for, we had like 14 trainings we had to do a year, and it actually became a game. We tried to speed run them, like, okay, how fast can you get these done? And we would post our times in the chat. Were we actually learning something? And I think that's where that gamification is so important. If you make training interesting, if you make it fun, then instead of, hitting people over the head and saying, hey, how come you haven't done your trainings yet? You get people who are proactive and want to invest the time. And then that's when they actually learn what the organization is trying to teach them in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, and to Tim's point about scenarios, I think and I'm reflecting back on some of the brain sharks and things I've done for compliance in the past, where, you're rolling your eyes at the end of the day because you're like, when would this actually happen? But I think the point is to deploy those scenarios in the context of something that is unfamiliar and messy and like very relatable, right? And so I'm reflecting back on, we did a in-person event in New York City a couple months ago, and we did a scenario around an AI powered cyber attack, and the folks in the room it was clear that like we really hadn't gotten to the place as an industry to think through how we would respond to an event like this. And so I think creating these scenarios and then gradually increasing the complexity and challenge is a great way to really engage your team on like real problem solving before that problem happens. So I know we're running out of time. I can't believe every time we have these, I'm always just blown away at how quickly the time passes. I do want to leave it open for others to chime in with any other questions. I think, Jason Haas, you submitted this question around how is healthcare working toward lowering the cost of the human element. We actually had pulled this kind of ripped from the headlines, not related to healthcare, but I think it's related in that like there is a very human element to, risk, even at the highest levels of the organization. These are very complex times to operate a business. And so how do you ensure that people are following proper protocol and procedure while at the same time not weighing them down under a bunch of bureaucracy and process? Andrea, do you want to answer that question specifically about healthcare
Sure. Yeah, I think healthcare, where we're finding was one, you were using data more. So to inform the patient that's in front of us. So by way of example, if you have information aggregating around a patient that can help identify that they're a fall risk, then the data that you're collecting in that regard can help that nurse take care of that patient in a more meaningful way, because it's a known risk then to them, because that assessment, that information that's gleaned. But really, it for us, it's really implementing those true like lean principles. Where risk and error occurs often comes in the points where waste is happening within the life cycle of care delivery. So if we create those practices that are the most efficient and streamlined as possible and reduce noise, we have greater a greater chance of getting it done right, and less of a chance of making an error along the way. So as much as we can, reduce and create efficiencies, but then also use the technology that we have as a stopgap, certain controls in place to do things like med reconciliation and flags for us, things that we might miss, but a system can tell us that we should identify. These two medications don't go together. The more that we can do that, the better we can be for our patients too. We'll never get rid of human error, because humans are involved.
Yeah, and I think in the FI space in the United States, what the Securities and Exchange Commission has done this week is really interesting. With SolarWinds issuing a Wells notice, naming the CISO, I don't think it's ever happened before. It's always been the CEO. Their new commentary around cybersecurity, and it's not just do you have cybersecurity. They're now asking publicly traded companies have to say, how are you mitigating risk? So the SEC is having much more open-ended questions, much more dynamic questions that I think is really going to push. Andrea spoke about at the top of the hour about how regulation drives compliance and risk management. The SEC has signaled this week they're going in a very different direction, a very thoughtful direction that's going to force a lot of companies to really change how they, govern and structure risk management.
So we have another question. Both of you mentioned risk appetite. Can you go deeper into what this actually looks like in practice? Is it a dollar amount, policy, et cetera?
Yeah. For us specifically, we had to reset our entire risk table, because what we realized as a leadership team is, as we're weighting risk level 1 to 5, that as users around the table, we were seeing things from a very subjective lens. And so it actually includes a variety of things: regulatory exposure, financial exposure, downtime, operational disruption, reputation and harm, strategic barriers, harm to patient, harm to team members. And those are all weighted, from a scale of 1 to 5, with, certain triggers within each box. And all that is mapped to our communication cascade to our board, or escalation or cascading. And so as we're sitting as leaders around the table, and I'm speaking to, from a regulatory perspective, this is a level 3 risk. Our financial person says, for me, this is actually a 2. And brand is turning around marketing and saying, yeah, this is a 4. So it helps us actually get to the heart of what is the driver of that risk, and where essentially do we land, so that we can make a fully informed and an assessment from an even playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. Your risk appetite and your risk capacity should have multiple factors. Andrea, that's an amazing example. And I would also say, if your risk appetite and your risk capacity, I don't even care what industry you're in, are exactly the same as they were 3 years ago, they're massively outdated.
All right. Well, thank you both. I think we're at the top of the hour here. So just want to make everyone aware we've got a guide that dives in more detail around risk and compliance's role in the new game of business agility. So if you haven't seen that yet on the website, go ahead and scan that QR code to access it. But we want to thank everybody for joining us today. In particular, Andrea and James, it's fantastic having this conversation with you this morning. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.